Picture two men in the deepest part of a Roman prison, in a city called Philippi, sometime in the 1st century. Their backs are torn open from a public beating. Their feet are locked into wooden stocks. The other prisoners around them are men who have already given up, men who know exactly what midnight sounds like in a place like this. Usually it sounds like silence, or moaning, or someone crying quietly so the guards won't hear. But tonight, it sounds like singing. You can hear two voices, rough and cracked, rising out of the dark. They are singing hymns, at midnight, in chains. And every prisoner in that cell is listening, because nobody sings like that after a beating like that, unless something has happened to them that the whip cannot touch. We are not telling you their names yet. Hold that thought. What we are telling you is this. Years later, an older version of one of those two men will sit down in a different prison, in a different city, facing a different kind of ending, and he will write a letter. And in that letter, he will use one word, in one form or another, about 16 times. Not freedom, not comfort, not even hope, though that word is there too. The word is joy. This is not a story about positive thinking. This is not a story about looking on the bright side. This is not a story about a man who simply had a sunny personality and got lucky with his attitude. This is a story about a letter written from a prison cell by a man who fully expected to be executed, and who used that letter to tell a small, struggling church in Greece that real joy has almost nothing to do with what is happening to you, and everything to do with where your eyes are fixed. That letter is the book of Philippians, and by the time we are done, you are going to read it completely differently. Here's what most people miss when they read Philippians. They read it as Paul's most upbeat letter, practically a greeting card. Rejoice in the Lord always. Cute verse for a bookmark. But you don't write rejoice 16 times in 4 short chapters because you're having a good day. You write it that many times because somebody needs convincing, maybe even yourself. To understand why, you have to go back before the second prison, back to the first one, back to the night those two men started singing, and to the city where it all began. Philippi was not just any city. It had been founded centuries earlier by the father of Alexander the Great, and after a famous battle on its plains, it became a Roman colony, packed with retired soldiers who were intensely, almost obsessively proud of their Roman citizenship. Keep that detail in your back pocket. It matters more than you think. Before there was a church in Philippi, there was a riverbank. A small group of women gathered there on the Sabbath to pray, because there wasn't even a synagogue in the city, not enough Jewish men to form one. Paul and his companions sat down with them, and one of those women was named Lydia. Lydia was not what you'd expect from a first convert story. She wasn't poor. She wasn't desperate. She ran a business, selling purple cloth, the kind of fabric that cost more than most people made in a year, the kind that draped the shoulders of senators and kings. Purple dye in the ancient world came from crushing thousands of tiny sea snails, and Lydia sold the finished product to people who could afford it. She was, by any measure, a successful woman in a man's economy. And when Paul told her about Jesus, Scripture says simply that the Lord opened her heart. Not that Paul argued her into it. Not that he gave a brilliant presentation. Her heart was opened. Like a door someone else was holding, finally swinging in. She was baptized that day, along with her whole household. And then she did something that tells you everything about her character. She opened her home. The church in Philippi, the very church that would later receive this letter about joy, started in Lydia's living room. Here's the part nobody tells you. A businesswoman, a Gentile, a foreigner from Thyatira, living in a Roman colony. She becomes the foundation of the first Christian church on European soil. Not a king, not a priest, a cloth merchant who opened her door. But Lydia's story is the gentle one. The next story is anything but gentle. Not long after, Paul and his companion Silas ran into trouble. They cast a demon out of a slave girl whose owners were making money off her, and those owners were furious. They dragged Paul and Silas before the city authorities, had them stripped and beaten with rods, and threw them into prison with their feet locked in stocks. This is where we left them, at midnight, singing, and this is where it gets remarkable. Around midnight, the ground itself starts to move, not a small tremor. Scripture describes it as violent enough to shake the foundations of the prison. The doors fly open, the chains fall loose. Now picture the jailer. He's a Roman soldier. His entire career has been built on one job: keep the prisoners in. He wakes up, sees every door standing open, and assumes the worst. Every prisoner has escaped, which under Roman law would have meant his own execution. So he draws his sword. He is about to end his own life, right there, rather than face the punishment. And out of the darkness, a voice stops him. It's Paul. "Don't harm yourself," he says. "We're all still here." You can imagine what that moment must have felt like for the jailer. The sword still in his hand, his life 1 second from being over, and instead, silence where there should have been chaos, and these 2 beaten, bloody prisoners telling him to put the sword down. He calls for lights. He falls down trembling in front of Paul and Silas, the men he had personally locked in chains a few hours earlier, and asks the question that changes everything. What must I do to be saved? That same night, in his own house, the jailer and his entire family are baptized. The man whose job was locking people up becomes, before sunrise, a member of the very church Lydia had started in her living room. Now, here's the thread you need to hold on to. The man who sang in that cell, the man who told a suicidal jailer to put down his sword, that man is Paul. And the letter we're talking about, the one with rejoice 16 times in it, was written by that same Paul years later, sitting in a different cell, in a different city, under a different kind of threat altogether. Stay with me, because this is where the letter actually starts to make sense. By the time Paul writes to the Philippians, he is older. He is most likely under house arrest in Rome, chained, guarded around the clock, waiting for his case to be decided by the imperial court, Caesar's court, under Emperor Nero. And Nero, as the Roman historian Tacitus recorded, was not a man known for mercy toward Christians. Within just a few years, Nero would blame Christians for the Great Fire of Rome and unleash brutal persecution against them. So when Paul sits down to write this letter, he is not writing from a place of safety. He genuinely does not know if he will live or die. In the very first chapter, he says it plainly. For him, living means Christ, and dying means gain. He's not being dramatic. He's being honest. He has thought about both outcomes, and he's at peace with either one. And to this church, the church of Lydia the businesswoman, and the jailer who almost killed himself, Paul writes about joy, over and over, 16 times. Paul isn't writing about joy because his circumstances are good. He's writing about joy from the exact same kind of place he was, in the night he sang in the Philippian jail. Chains, uncertainty, and a song anyway. There's a word Paul uses early in the letter that sets the tone for everything that follows. Koinonia. It's usually translated fellowship, but that word is too soft. Koinonia is what business partners share, not just the profits, but the risk. When Paul thanks the Philippians for their partnership in the gospel, he means it literally. They didn't just cheer him on from a distance. They sent money. They sent supplies. At one point, they sent a person. And the Greek word behind joy itself, chara, sits right next to another Greek word, charis, which means grace. That's not an accident. In Paul's mind, the two are almost the same idea. Joy isn't something you manufacture. It's the natural response to grace you didn't earn and can't lose, even from inside a cell. Hold on to that. Because the next part of this letter gets personal in a way that most sermons skip right past. Before we go further, here's what we've found so far. A businesswoman who opens her home. A jailer who nearly takes his own life and instead finds a new one. And a man in chains who keeps using the word joy like it's the only word that matters. 3 very different people, one church, one letter. And we're only about a third of the way through. If you've made it this far, hit subscribe, because the next part of this letter is where Paul stops talking about other people's stories and starts talking about his own scars, his own friends, and a conflict inside this church that most people never even notice is there. Here's the part of the letter that almost nobody talks about, and it's one of the most human moments in the entire New Testament. The Philippian church had heard that Paul was in prison, possibly facing execution, and they did what any church that loves its founder would do. They took up a collection, money, supplies, things Paul would need, and they sent it to him in Rome. But sending money wasn't enough. They sent a person to carry it, a man named Epaphroditus. We don't know much about Epaphroditus' background. We don't know his age. What we do know is that the journey from Philippi to Rome was not a quick errand. It meant traveling by land and by sea, hundreds of miles, through territory that was not always safe, to deliver a gift to a man the Roman government considered a criminal. And on that journey, or shortly after he arrived, Epaphroditus got sick. Not a cold. Paul says he was sick near unto death. This man left his home, his church, possibly his family, to take care of Paul, and it nearly cost him his life. Paul writes about this with a tenderness that should stop you in your tracks. He doesn't say, "Unfortunately, our courier fell ill." He calls Epaphroditus his brother, his co-worker, his fellow soldier. 3 different words for the same man, each one adding weight. And Paul says God had mercy not just on Epaphroditus, but on Paul himself. Because if Epaphroditus had died on this errand of love, Paul says he would have carried that grief on top of everything else he was already carrying. Think about that for a second. A man in prison, awaiting a verdict that could end his life, is more worried about the grief he'd feel over a friend's death than he is about his own situation. There's one more thing buried in the middle of this letter, and it might be the most important paragraph Paul ever wrote. In the 2nd chapter, Paul describes Jesus using a Greek word that has become its own theological term, Kenosis. The verb is ekenosin, emptied himself. Paul says that Christ, though he was equal with God, did not hold on to that status. He emptied himself. He took on the form of a servant, and he was obedient, all the way to death on a cross. You have to understand how shocking this would have sounded to the people of Philippi. Remember what we told you to keep in your back pocket. Philippi was a Roman colony, full of retired soldiers who were proud of their citizenship, proud of their status, proud of climbing the ladder. And Paul is telling them that the God of the universe did the opposite. He didn't climb, he descended, on purpose, all the way down, to a cross, the most shameful, most degrading death the Roman Empire had. This is the example Paul holds up, not as a nice religious idea, but as the actual blueprint for how the Philippians should treat each other. And that blueprint leads directly into the part of this letter most people skip past entirely, because it's awkward. Near the end of the letter, Paul does something you almost never see in the New Testament. He names names. 2 women, Euodia and Syntyche, women who had clearly worked alongside Paul in the past. He calls them his fellow laborers, women whose names, he says, are written in the book of life. These are not minor figures. These are leaders. And Paul pleads with them, by name, in a letter meant to be read out loud to the entire church, to agree with each other in the Lord. Sit with that for a moment. This letter, full of the word joy, written by a man possibly facing execution, contains a public appeal to 2 women in conflict. Paul doesn't hide it. He doesn't soften it into vague language about unity. He names them, because he knows the church reading this letter already knows exactly who he's talking about. Pay attention to this. The joy Paul keeps talking about isn't a private feeling you keep to yourself while everything around you falls apart. It's something that's supposed to show up in how you treat the person you're in conflict with. Joy and conflict, in Paul's mind, are not opposites. You can have both at the same time, and the way you handle the second one reveals whether you actually have the first. By this point in the letter, Paul has talked about a businesswoman who opened her home, a jailer who almost died and didn't, a friend who almost died and didn't, 2 women in conflict, and the example of a God who emptied himself. And now Paul is about to turn the camera on himself, on his own life, his own losses, and the verdict hanging over his head. But it gets stranger before it gets clearer. Paul had a resume that most religious people in his world would have killed for. He was a Pharisee, trained under one of the most respected teachers of his generation. He was a Roman citizen by birth, something most people in the empire could never buy or earn. He had zeal, credentials, a spotless record by the standards of his own religion. And in the next part of this letter, Paul takes that entire resume, everything he used to be proud of, and he uses a word for it that is so blunt, so crude, that most English translations soften it into something polite. We're not going to soften it. Stay with us. Here's the word, Skybala. It's Greek, and in everyday first-century speech, it wasn't a polite word. It meant garbage, waste, the kind of word you'd use for something thrown out with the trash. And this is the word Paul chooses, deliberately, to describe his entire former life, his training, his status, his credentials, his Roman citizenship in a city obsessed with Roman citizenship. Garbage. Compared to what? Compared to knowing Christ. This is not a man casually downgrading his resume. This is a man in chains, facing a death sentence from the very empire whose citizenship he once prized, looking back at everything he used to build his identity on, and calling it trash next to what he has now. And here's where it gets personal for Paul, in a way the rest of the letter has been building toward. Picture him in that rented room in Rome. A soldier is chained to him, probably literally. That was standard practice for Roman house arrest. He cannot leave. He cannot work his old trade. He is completely dependent on gifts, like the one Epaphroditus risked his life to deliver. And somewhere in the city, behind closed doors, people are deciding whether he lives or dies. You know what that feels like, even if you've never been in a Roman prison. You know what it feels like to be in a waiting room, waiting for a doctor to come back with results, waiting for a phone call that will either end with relief or end with grief, waiting for a verdict you have no control over. Time stretches. Every sound from the hallway makes your heart jump. And in that waiting room, before any news arrives, you have to decide something. What is your face going to do when the door opens? Paul made that decision before the door opened. For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Either outcome is a win. If he lives, he keeps working. If he dies, he's with Jesus. He has, in a very real sense, already won the case, no matter what Caesar's court decides. This is not a story about a man who got lucky with his personality. This is not a story about ignoring real suffering and just staying positive. This is a story about a man who looked straight at the worst possible outcome, execution under Nero, and found that even that outcome could not touch the one thing he actually valued. And now, remember the two men singing in that first prison, years earlier? In Philippi? At midnight in chains, after a beating, with their feet in stocks? That was Paul. And Silas, the same Paul, the man writing "Rejoice in the Lord always" from a Roman prison near the end of his life, is the same man who sang hymns in a Macedonian prison near the beginning of his ministry. Different cell, different city, different threat, same song. That's not a coincidence, and it's not a coping mechanism. By the time Paul writes this letter, he has lived this principle for years, in real prisons, with real chains, in front of real people who watched him do it. The jailer who almost killed himself watched Paul sing before he ever read a word Paul wrote. The Philippian church didn't just receive a letter about joy and suffering, they had seen it, in person, at midnight, years before it became a verse. That's why, when Paul tells them to rejoice always, it doesn't sound like a slogan. It sounds like an invitation to join a song he's already been singing for a very long time. There's one more piece of this letter that ties everything together. Paul's words near the very end, where he says he has learned to be content, whatever the circumstances, whether full or hungry, whether with plenty or with nothing. He uses the word learned on purpose. This wasn't natural to him. It wasn't his personality. It was a skill, built over years, the same years that included shipwrecks, beatings, prison cells, and now this final imprisonment with a verdict hanging over his head. Contentment, for Paul, was not the absence of hard circumstances. It was the presence of something steadier than the circumstances, something that didn't change whether he was free or chained, whether he was eating well or going hungry, whether the door of his cell opened to a guard with good news or bad news. And that's the joy he's been talking about this whole time, not happiness. Happiness depends on what happens to you, which is exactly what the word means. Joy, in Paul's hands, depends on what you're looking at. And Paul, in chains, in Rome, possibly weeks away from execution, was looking at the same thing he'd been looking at since a midnight in a Philippian jail. Not the walls, not the chains, not the verdict, something else entirely. So when you read "Rejoice in the Lord always" on a coffee mug or a wall decoration, you're reading the condensed version of a sentence written by a man chained to a soldier, having already lost everything he used to call success, not knowing if he'd be alive in a month. He wasn't writing it because his life was easy. He was writing it because he had found something an execution couldn't take away from him. And he wanted the church he loved, the church of Lydia and the jailer and Epaphroditus and Euodia and Syntyche, to have it too. So here's what this letter actually teaches. And it's not what most people think. First, joy in the Bible is not the same thing as happiness. Happiness is a reaction to your circumstances. Joy, the way Paul uses it, is a settled confidence that doesn't depend on circumstances at all, which is why a man in chains could use that word 16 times in one letter without it sounding hollow. Second, this kind of joy isn't private. It shows up in how you treat the people around you, even the ones you're in conflict with. Paul didn't just tell the Philippians to feel joyful. He named 2 women by name and asked them to live it out in front of everyone. And third, this is the one that should stay with you. The joy Paul writes about wasn't a theory he came up with from a comfortable office somewhere. He had already lived it, at midnight, in a Philippian jail, in chains, after a beating, with a man on the verge of taking his own life listening from a few feet away. By the time he wrote, "Rejoice in the Lord always," it wasn't advice. It was a testimony. He was simply telling them, "I've been here before. I sang then, I'm singing now, and whatever you're facing, whatever cell you're in, whatever verdict you're waiting for, you can sing too. Not because everything is fine, but because of where your eyes are." Out of everything in this letter, Lydia, the jailer, Epaphroditus, the conflict between Euodia and Syntyche, Paul's own chains, which one hit you the hardest? Tell us in the comments, because somewhere, right now, someone is sitting in their own version of that Roman prison, and they need to know the song still works.